Well, it's good to talk to you again. And obviously I've interviewed you a number of times. You've actually written for us at The Escapist ages ago. So it's part of why I was excited to be able to do this event with you. And I'm excited about your new game. Before we get into specific questions, is there anything general you want to talk about? I know you just launched this week. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really exciting. OtherSide is a couple of years old. We're just getting out of startup mode, frankly, and we're really excited. It's our first major release as a studio. So, yeah, everyone's really excited about it.
That's fantastic. I'm so excited for you. How's it going so far?
It's going really well. Actually, on the first day, we were the #1 game on Steam, and we had a few thousand streamers, live streamers. So that's pretty cool, and we're happy that the game is doing justice to the immersive sim genre and maybe pushing that forward a little bit.
I wanted to, as my first question for you, Warren, I wanted to take you back to 2006, where you wrote a series of articles at The Escapist. I was there at the time. I think you wrote them off of a talk you had given. The series was called Gaming in the Margins. And you covered a lot of ground in that series, but one of your central theses was the idea that the future of gaming lied not with AAA blockbusters necessarily, but in the margins, right? i.e. in an energetic indie space. And in 2006, the idea of an energetic indie space that we know of today was kind of a future forward-looking prediction. Kind of a radical proposition, yet in the ensuing years, more or less right after you made that prediction, the indie scene exploded, and now here we are. What do you think were the key moments over the past decade that transpired, or events that transpired that helped prove out that theory that the future of gaming really would be in a vibrant indie space, or, as you said, at the margins?
Well, you could kind of see it coming. Everybody back then was talking about, digital distribution. We were well into the era of prepackaged game engines. We used Unreal, a heavily modified version of Unreal for Deus Ex, and for Thief, Deadly Shadows and Deus Ex Invisible War. And then, Unity comes along, and all of a sudden, not only do you have engines you can use that anyone can use, you have free engines that are really user-friendly. So I think you put those two things together, something like Steam had to come along to make it possible. And what happened was, the reason it's so exciting is because we got to a point where basically if you had an idea for a game, you had the tools to make it and an opportunity to get it in front of an audience. And in 2006 even, that wasn't really the case. You could just see it on the horizon, but back then, if you weren't backed by a major publisher, you really didn't have a whole lot of options for releasing your game. There was shareware, of course, but the explosion of indie, I think, is really digital distribution and the existence of game engines. Mm-hmm. Plus, hey, actually, now that I think about it, the other aspect that was just beginning to be true back then was games education. There according to the ESA, there are over 400 institutions of higher learning that are offering either courses or full degree programs in game development. So not only do you have ways of making and reaching an audience with a game, you have lots and lots of people who want to do it. So all of that together, I think, is the reason we see it now.
Yeah, just to back up a little bit, Warren, maybe you can talk about the relation between Underworld Ascended and Ultima Underworld, which you produced way back in the early 90s.
Yeah, what is it, 1992, I think.
Yeah.
The thing that just blows my mind is that people still care. When Deus Ex hit its 50th anniversary, I think I did more PR than I did when the game came out. People were more interested in talking about it then. But to go back to 1992, wow. a game that people still care about passionately is pretty incredible. The relationship is interesting. It's not an Ultima game per se. That's something I guess EA didn't really want us to do. but there are certain elements of the game. Kabyrus is a character from the original game. The Lizardmen language is out of the first game. The runic spell casting is a direct descendant of what we did in the original Ultima Underworld. And there are little things here and there for fans, but we really wanted to do something that captured the spirit, the essence of those original games, but wasn't a straight sequel or something that just recreates what we did. I mean, how many years ago is that? Is that 26 years? Good Lord. We didn't just want to recreate that.
Yeah, and it's profoundly influential. Like I mentioned this on New World Notes, that Second Life was partly inspired by Ultima Underworld because Philip Rosedale, the founder, played the game for 100 hours and kind of realized that you could simulate a whole kind of contiguous, coherent world.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and Sinespace is kind of one of the sort of successors to that virtual world. So we kind of would not be here were it not for Ultima Underworld.
Well, I'm not sure I would be here without Ultima Underworld. I mean, I worked on Ultima 6, which was an early kind of immersive simulation in some simple ways. But Underworld was really the first real-time, fully texture map, first-person game that made you believe you were in another world and that offered you opportunities to deal with problems rather than simple puzzles. And that led to System Shock, which led to, Thief, which led to Deus Ex, which led to all sorts of things nowadays. So I think it's kind of amazing how influential Underworld was. And the thing is, I don't want to pat myself on the back too hard, but I'll never forget when Paul Neurath, my partner at OtherSide, first showed the tech demo that ultimately became Underworld. And I remember there were a bunch of us standing around looking over each other's shoulders. This was at Origin. And I looked over his shoulder and saw this tech demo and thought, literally, I thought the world just changed. It just changed forever. And sure enough, there it was a couple of years later. And the world really did change in a small way, at least.
I know you wanted to ask Warren about some of the characters we see, and I think that's a really good segue to do so. I'm happy to yield the floor because I'm curious to know about them too.
Yeah, because we imported, because we're both Sinespace and Ascendant are on Unity, so we were able to bring over some of the characters. So that's what you're seeing around you. And the audience, maybe, Warren, you can talk a little bit about the characters, how they fit into the game.
Sure. Well, I'm not actually looking at them. So there's a skeleton and a lizard man, if I remember correctly. The big bad guy in Underworld Ascendant is a character named Typhon, who was, in Greek mythology, was an enemy of Zeus. And even Zeus couldn't really defeat him, so he's a pretty powerful guy. His minions are the undead, and so the skeletons are, there are a bunch of varieties of them, but the skeletons are the enemies you meet in the kind of early parts of the game as minions of Typhon. And the lizard men are actually kind of your allies. They're not enemies per se. So you interact with them in a variety of places, but in a city called Markal, where they kind of mediate, I guess, with factions that exist off screen. In this game, you don't actually interact with the Shamblers and the Expedition and the others, the Deep Elves, but they exist in the shadows, basically. And your interactions with them, their representatives are the lizard men that you encounter in Markal.
You were talking about ways of solving problems within the simulations you created. What are some examples in the new game?
There are places where there are jumps that are too long for you to use, and so you have to use magic, or you can use magic to get across. But there's always another way. It's not that you have to do that. You have to get to the other side, but there are lots of different ways to do it. And some of them are multiple path stuff that's kind of pre-planned, but a bunch of them are are built into the environment itself and how you interact with it. There are things like there are slugs that leave a trail behind them, and you can discover that the trail is flammable. So if you're out of weapons or something, you can use fire in the environment to set their trail on fire and either block enemies or take them out like that. It isn't a game where you just have to swing a sword endlessly and chop wood. Or fire arrows at something from a distance. There are always a variety of ways to get past the problems, and that's key for me anyway. I tell my teams the word puzzle is not allowed in this studio. You cannot say the word puzzle. We create challenges, we create problems, and then we give the player tools to solve those problems or overcome those challenges. That's kind of what immersive sims are all about. It's not about pre-planned encounters and showing off how clever and creative you are as a designer. It's about letting players show how clever and creative they are.
That's fascinating.
If you let me keep talking, I'll talk all day. Somebody say something quick.
I know this about you, Warren. It's funny. Another good friend of mine, game developer, calls that the community. What you just described, the game having more fun than the player, right? Where you create a situation that's, and I think what he ultimately means is that when the designer is having more fun than the player, you've sort of lost sight of the point.
Yeah, I've played games, which I will not name, by the way, that play themselves better than you can play them.
So one of the things you and I have talked about a couple of times, and that I've heard you, I can't remember the event where I first heard you talk about this, but the idea that increasing photorealism in video games would start to bog down AAA development as it tried to replicate, everything in a realistic way. And I believe the example you used back in the day was a character bumping into a table, and there's a glass of water on the table, and the table has to shake, and the glass of water has to shake, and maybe the water spills, and it just becomes kind of a set of diminishing returns of attempting to create that realistic of a scenario. Is that Otherworld and Ultima? Are you attempting to sort of reclaim some creative space from that series of diminishing returns, or how big a problem is that for you these days?
Well, for OtherSide, it's a huge problem because we're an indie studio and can't put hundreds of people on projects. On Underworld Ascendant, the team was 14, I believe, and we're working on System Shock 3 down here in Austin, and the team is 17. So we're never going to compete with the big AAA monster teams, monster games. I'm actually pretty impressed at how far we've come since I said that. The AAA space really is getting to the point where you can build a deeply interactive and immersive game and still have it look that way. Almost photoreal. We're not quite there yet. But for OtherSide, we knew going in that we couldn't compete with that. And so what we wanted to do in Ascendant and also in System Shock 3 is find a stylized look for the game that kind of unasks the question about, well, why doesn't this look as good as game X? And so if you look at Underworld Ascendant, you'll see a highly stylized environment that is in fact inspired by miniatures gaming. Like a real D&D game, and it looks like a miniature set and painted miniatures by design. And in fact, many of the characters and items in the game were really modeled out. There are three-dimensional, solid, real-world models of things in the game that are unbelievably cool. I mean, if we had a brain in our heads, we'd be selling, 3D printed versions of the things in the game, and who knows, maybe that'll happen. But again, we couldn't compete with that, so we had to take a different direction, and it just happens to be a direction that plays nicely with the kind of systemic, immersive sim sort of ethos.
I can imagine you getting into sort of the game to life space, right? With these miniatures that you can then plug into your game. That would be kind of cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're taking feature requests, but log that one for me if you will.
Okay, it's written down. We'll get right on it.
Excellent. James, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Unity, and since Sinespace and Underworld are made in Unity, I wonder if you can talk about the challenges and advantages of creating an immersive world on Unity. And I think I know Will on your team is with you, so in case he wants to jump in, he can help out too.
I'll start and then turn this over very quickly to Will, because I'm the opposite of a tech guy. Unity's been great. We've been working very closely with them and getting lots of input and assistance, sneak peeks at what's coming next for Unity. And there's lots of very cool stuff coming next for Unity, which I will probably get killed if I talk about, but it's been great. Having an engine to start with and build on top of is critical, and Unity's been a great partner. So, Will, if you want to jump in, feel free. You're the guy who did all the typing.
I didn't do all of it. Hi, everyone. I'm Will. I'm Will Teixeira, the lead engineer on Underworld Descendants. And yeah, so as for the challenges of Unity, I'd say that one of the biggest challenges with Unity is that it has a lot of power, and you can easily hang yourself with that power by trying to do way too much with what's there, because you're given so many dials and there's so much you can do, and you want to keep your scope correct and stay on the right track, otherwise you'll go down into rabbit holes of different areas in the engine. And so, but using Unity has been amazing for making an immersive sim, because it's really fast to build up systems from scratch and have systems interact with each other, because Unity's biggest power is extremely fast implementation and extremely fast reiteration on existing tech. So every system that we've built, we've been able to iterate on it rapidly over and over and over, just to make it feel better and better.
Back in the day when we were working at Looking Glass, we had a system that was built for Thief called Act React, which was, how different systems interact with different objects in the world in this sort of rules-based way. And I would circulate Act React documents to the team down here, and they would just roll their eyes and look at me and say, "Come on, Unity already does that." So yeah, pretty powerful tool.
That's great. And what was the development cycle like with Underworld?
Well, it was pretty long. It started as a Kickstarter project.
Right.
What was it? 3 years ago? I think it was 3 years ago. Which, I mean, it is a long time. I realize that, and it sounds like a long time. But the reality is, when I'm never going to work again after I say this, but when I talk to publishers, I always tell them, if you look at the last 6 games I've done, they've all taken about 3 years to make, between 32 and 36 months. So if I tell you I'm going to make a game in less than 3 years, just know that I'm lying to you. and I still keep getting work. It's amazing.
That's actually a really good segue to my next question. And I want before I spool that out, I wanted to remind the folks in the audience, if you have questions for Warren, click that giant queue behind us, pop those in there. James and I are going to run out of steam at some point, and I want to get your questions in before the hour is up. But Warren, speaking of still getting work, when I think about your career, not only is it incredibly impressive, but you've created worlds at Origin, you've made blockbuster hits, you've started franchises with like Deus Ex, for example. You resurrected Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, for crying out loud. I mean, some might say you've squeezed games for everything it can offer. What do you continue to get out of making games? What brings you back at this point in your career?
Being brought back is actually pretty accurate. When Disney shut Junction Point down as kind of the leading edge of getting out of internal development, frankly, I was pretty broken up. I mean, I loved working for Disney, and I loved Junction Point and all the folks who worked there. It was one of the highlights of my life, actually, working there. And so, but when it came to an end, I I had to take a break. I realized that I needed some different challenges. I've been making games for, well, a long time. Let's just say, 30 years or some craziness like that. And so I went into teaching. I built a game development program at the University of Texas. I'm really proud of what we did there, but I made a 3-year commitment, and about a year and a half into it, I said to myself, oh man, molding young minds is great, but I still need to make some things. And so at the end of 3 years, I came back, and I was going to do a startup, actually. I was going to start another studio of my own. And Paul Neurath, who I've known for about 30 years, came to me, and he was the guy behind Looking Glass, and
right.
Designed the first couple of levels in the original Underworld, and did a game called Space Rogue, which is little remembered, but was pretty influential on me. But anyway, he came to me and he said he was starting a studio, and did I want to go in with him on it, and that he had the rights to do new Underworld games and new System Shock games, and was I interested? And it's like, how could I say no to that? We've learned so much since the early to mid 90s. Bringing all that knowledge to these old franchises was a great opportunity. So there's still, I still love those worlds. I love the world of System Shock, and I still love the world of Deus Ex. Man, if I could go back to that, it'd be great.
Someone needs to get the license and give it back to you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Right.
Yeah. Ubisoft has done some interesting things with the franchise, but would love to see what you do with it.
Yeah, I would
platform.
too, actually.
Okay, so we have news here. If Ubisoft wants to hire Orange Spectre to do another Deus game.
No. Hold on. I've got a full-time gig right now.
Oh well, there is that little thing. Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, and if Disney wants me to come back and do an Oswald game or another Mickey game or a Donald Duck game, I'm up for that too.
There you go. That's really good. We should talk a little bit about System Shock 3. I know the license was kind of trapped for a long time. I remember Ken Levine was trying to get it, and he ended up doing BioShock just because it was sort of locked. So what happened? How did you guys get the license, and what are you planning to do with it in terms of System Shock 3?
Yeah, it was pretty locked down when there was all this weirdness about Electronic Arts owning some of the rights and Looking Glass owning some of the rights, and Looking Glass went out of business, and an insurance company ended up taking all of their properties, and so nobody knew what the rights situation was. And then a couple things happened. By the way, I'm not going to claim to be a lawyer, so I could be getting a lot of things wrong here. But my understanding is that a company called Night Dive got the rights to the trademark, the System Shock trademark, from this crazy insurance company. And Paul went to Electronic Arts and came away with the copyright. So all of the actual material in the game belongs to OtherSide, and the trademark belongs to Night Dive. And so we work closely together. Obviously, we're kind of bound by that. But that's how we got to make System Shock 3.
That's really great, and yeah, maybe give us a hint of what it's going to be in it, what's new, and sort of when we can start playing it.
I would love to start talking about this, trust me, but all I can really say is we're going to ship sometime, and there'll be some new stuff in it. You'll learn the fates of some of the people from the earlier games, and strangely enough, Citadel Station is, probably going to make a comeback in some way or other. And
That's
Shodan will definitely be back.
Awesome.
And Terry Brocious, who did the voice of Shodan, is back doing it again for us. So we're real excited about that.
That was my next question, if Terry can do it. That's really cool.
Absolutely. And if I say any more, Starbreeze, which is our publisher, they'll kill me, and then the game will never get made.
And it's coming out in less than 3 years, right?
Well, there you go.
I am seeing audience questions, but yeah, just one more from me. I'd love to talk about Sinespace. You can access it in VR, and so let's talk a little bit about VR. 3 years ago, you expressed some concerns around the hype over VR, telling me there's some big problems that are cultural and social, saying I believe most people will be genuinely frightened and disoriented of being effectively blind to the outside world for the sake of entertainment. So I was wondering what your perspective is now, and how do you think that relates to the future of game design?
My opinion is exactly the same as it was then. The hype has died down pretty dramatically and appropriately. And, is it a fad that's going to go away? There's a part of me that still thinks that. But at the very least, I think the fact that it's not being hyped quite so much will allow the people working in the space to work out the kinks, to figure stuff out, which when that spotlight is on you, it's very hard to experiment. I mean, it's hard to fail, right? I mean, the way to succeed is to fail over and over and over again until you get it right. And people have been failing at virtual reality since Jaron Lanier was doing it, who I know was one of the folks who came and did one of these before. My opinion hasn't changed a whole lot. The interesting hypey space now is augmented reality, and I'm still a little dubious about that. No one's done anything that makes me go, oh my god, I have to go play in that sandbox. At least it doesn't isolate you completely from the world, so you have to worry about your wife coming up behind you with a baseball bat.
It's a legitimate fear.
That's a very specific direction to go in that one, Warren. Does that come from a personal place, maybe? Are we getting a hint?
My wife might be listening to this, so let's not go there.
Hi, Carolyn.
That's hilarious.
But I haven't seen much developers creating solutions for that feeling of being isolated. I know there's some pass-through technology, but other than that, I see users like they will create like door locks and other ways of making sure no one can sneak up on them, but I don't see developers kind of acknowledging that it is a very isolating thing.
Yeah, it's a hard problem to solve. I mean, it may be a problem that doesn't have a solution, That's a definite possibility. I don't know. I mean, just personally, I have very little interest in exploring that space, to be frank. I'm still a screen space kind of guy.
That mirrors my feeling about the space as well. I personally have a huge difficulty with having something attached to my face in general, aside from the isolation. But I know a lot of people who are solving some interesting problems in VR and who are working with some really cool new ideas and new tech. So I don't know. My sense is, just as an observer of the space, that there will continue to be a place for it, but I'm not sure it's going to sort of crest that wave that it needs to crest to become more mainstream.
I think there are amazing uses for it, in training and maybe even psychotherapy.
Definitely.
There are all sorts of uses for it. As a game medium, I'm just not sure. And I actually say that from a position of some experience, not a lot, but back at Origin, I did 2 games. Well, okay, that was, 2 times VR came back that VR came back to change the face of gaming. 2 times ago. A game I did called Wings of Glory, and the original System Shock actually supported the Forte VFX1 and the CyberMax, which were the two big VR headsets back then. This would have been, 94. And I'll tell you a funny story. The world was not ready for it, or they were not ready for the world. But two fun stories. One was, and I won't tell you which one it was, but one of these things was so heavy, so not ready for prime time. I went down to my QA team one day, and I wanted to talk to my lead tester, and he was wearing one of these headsets, and it was smoking on his head. It got so hot that it was this close to setting on fire. So we don't have to worry about that anymore. But the other thing was, Wings of Glory was a World War I flight sim where we modeled the cockpit in 3D, and so you had to look around. You didn't have radar or missiles or anything like that, right? You just had a machine gun that faced forward, and so we supported the headsets, and this will completely date me now, but the software buyer for Software Etc., which was that, for those of you who are too young, that was a software store where people sold boxes, and inside there were these discs.
What?
Yeah. Anyway, he came in and he was going to buy 15,000 copies of Wings of Glory. And so what we did was we got this thing called a Thunder Seat, which was basically just a big subwoofer under a leather seat, and put a joystick down in front of it, and sat him down in the Thunder Seat, which rumbled. You know, like when you got shot, you would feel that you got shot, and you know, when you're taxiing down a runway, you would feel the ruts in the runway and everything. And so we sat him down there. He's got a joystick between his legs. He's got a VR headset on, so he's seeing the cockpit and the landing strip and all that. And we tied a scarf around his neck, and then one of my producers set a box fan down in front of him. So, and turned it on, and he was taxiing down the field to take off. Anyway, he took the headset off after this experience, and he increased his orders to 75,000. It was awesome.
Wow.
So VR did me some good.
Well, that's good.
That was back in the Lawnmower Man days of VR, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
That is
Amazing.
awesome.
And I think, Adam, you had a kind of follow-up question around this?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about new and experimental devices, I think it's hard to go past the fact that when you look at sort of all the demographics, that mobile is where the average user is at. I mean, it's rapidly heading towards the point where a lot of people don't have computers, especially younger audiences. I mean, what are your thoughts on the difficulties of doing sort of immersive and high-quality experiences on those mobile platforms, especially with the limitations of input?
Yeah, you know, I can't speak for any personal experience because I've never done it. I've always thought it'd be kind of cool to make a mobile game, but then I start thinking about the kinds of games that I like to make, and as powerful and ubiquitous as they are, though it's tempting, I don't know how I would actually do it, you know? So if someone's stupid enough to give me some money, I'll give it a try, but I don't really know how I would make an immersive simulation game for you know, an iPhone or something. But I'm a total hypocrite because I almost never turn on my PC at home. It's all iPad and iPhone, and Apple's not paying me, though they probably should now.
What kind of games are you playing lately on your iPhone?
Well, on my iPhone, this is pathetic. I play a lot of solitaire. And there's what is the name of it? There's another card game that I've been playing. It's a fantasy card game, the name of which is eluding me, but it's a ton of fun. You're trying to...
From the Elder Scrolls one?
No. Anyway, I'm not going to get obsessive about this, but there's another card game that's pretty fun. And I'm doing most of my gaming now on my Switch, frankly. You know,
Switch is cool. Yeah.
When I'm not playing Underworld Ascendant and System Shock 3, my Switch is pretty much the thing.
So we do have some audience questions. Jump into them a little bit. Someone named Binary Split, cool name, says, do you think there's a fundamental limit to the potential scope of immersive sims? Or is there a chance we'll eventually get immersive sims that one could play forever?
Forever is a really long time. And even an immersive sim where it's all rules-based and systemic, there's still a lot of content you have to provide.
Mm-hmm.
So forever is probably too big a word. For forever, I think, well, even I was going to say, you know, you kind of have to be in the MMO space where you're interacting with other players, or you know, the more sort of sports-oriented games like, you know, multiplayer FPSs. They're really just sports. They're not games anymore. And MMOs are you know, this sort of team-based stuff. That's where I think you get forever from, or as close as we're ever going to get, given how fast technology changes. But having said that, one of the things I love about immersive sims is because it's about problem solving and overcoming challenges, you can play them over and over again. You know, I've got a friend who's not a gamer who played through Deus Ex 7 times. And there was one time I was at a game developers conference, and a guy came up to me dressed as J.C. Denton.
Oh wow!
And he was from Germany, or he had a very thick German accent actually when I met him, and he said, "I've played through Deus Ex 63 times."
Holy cow!
And I said, "Come on, 60? Come on." He said, "No, I've played it through 63 times." And then he said words that were magic to my ears. He said, "I'm going back to Germany tomorrow." Because I didn't even want to be on the same continent as someone who played through Deus Ex. So,
I am coming to your house next, Warren. That is my game.
Hey, I have an unlisted phone number for a reason.
That's amazing. Actually, someone, Julian3D, another audience question, had a related question of comment on how players play a role in ability to contribute as we move to procedurally created games. So I guess something like No Man's Sky or something like that.
Procedural generation is really interesting. You know, I'm a fan of roguelikes, you know, and you certainly see some people doing that. I've always been afraid. I mean, I'm a kind of a believer in not curated experiences, but curated environments, I guess.
Right.
Which is very much what Underworld Ascendant does. They're curated environments into which are built those problems that you can solve however you want. But certainly, without saying too much, okay, don't read anything into this because we're not doing this in System Shock 3. But we have certainly had discussions about, you know, wouldn't it be cool if we could build in some roguelike elements? It's very unlikely that'll happen in System Shock 3, but at some point in the future, I think you'll probably see some of us immersive sim folks trying to build in some of that kind of thinking into our games. That's an interesting question.
Got a Unity question from Ro Gastel. On the technical side, what are your recommendations for good performance in Unity as far as frame rate and such?
Over to you, Will.
Yeah, Will might want to jump in on this.
Good performance in general for frame rates. I'd say the biggest thing to worry about is anything that moves from the CPU to the video card. And so set pass calls are where it's at when it comes to that. We kind of became experts at that because at OtherSide we shipped a mobile VR game, which is a pretty awesome game. You guys should check it out. It's called Underworld Overlord. And in that we found out that we needed to keep our set pass calls at under 100 per eyeball on the phone. Now that was a phone from like 2 years ago running VR, so that was a lot to take in. So that's probably the one biggest thing to look at, and definitely use the Unity profiler because that profiler is amazing.
That's really cool. Have you guys, another person, Sassy Love, said, have you ever considered opening a help group for Unity? So I guess fellow developers or maybe a Slack channel or something?
Hey, we've got games to build, you know? That's enough work.
Someone wants tech support. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Oh, someone asked another. Oh, so yeah, Warren. In the 90s, many famous games, including yours at Origin, were releasing multiple games per year. Now it seems like there's a 3-year minimum, like you mentioned. What has changed, and can we go back?
Well, what's
also for binary split?
I don't think anything's changed really. At Origin, we had at one point 7, we called them producer groups, and each one of them was, a profit center. We got I had my own budget. Richard Garriott had his own budget. Chris Roberts had his own budget, and we had to make money, or we'd get fired. But what it meant was, I could release a game in the same year that Chris released a game, in the same year that Richard Garriott released a game. I had a different kind of business model than those guys did. Richard and Chris were making real AAA blockbuster games, huge budgets, big teams for the time. And I was kind of the B-movie guy. I was the guy who said, I don't want to swing for the fences. I want to play small ball and go for singles. So what I would do is I would start up 4 projects, and at the end of the year, I would tell 4 developers. I had 2 internal and 2 external projects, and I would tell those 4 teams, 2 of you are going to die at the end of this year, and 2 of you are going to ship. And then I would start 2 more, so I had 4 going, and at the end of the next year, 2 of them would die, and then the other 2 would ship. And so I was able to ship usually 2 games a year because I was willing to work with external and internal teams. And what it meant was, rather than being totally immersed in one game, I could actually, be kind of a dilettante and look in on each of the games and say, no, that's not what we want. Make that pixel blue, not green. So it was an interesting way to do business, and I kind of stopped. There was a point where a guy from Electronic Arts, who I will not name because we didn't get along. Anyway. I'll tell that story in my autobiography that I'm never going to write.
Oh, I can't wait.
Anyway, he said, it's a hit-driven business. I mean, to make a long story short, it's a hit-driven business. And Richard and Chris have the right idea. You've got to go for a home run. And so I thought he was wrong at the time, but as it turned out, the way gaming developed, he was right. I hate to admit it, but he was right. And so I scaled back and started playing that AAA game that Chris and Rich were playing, and did 1 game at a time, which has its advantages. I mean, obviously I get to make a lot more of the calls. I'm more deeply immersed in the development of a single game, but I do kind of miss that, having my fingers in a lot of different pies. It was like juggling. It was a lot of fun, very exciting, and unnerving, in a different way than working on one big game is. But now, we're in a world of one big game, so there you go.
Yeah, definitely. Another question, actually, from Dick Vijay on our team. He says he wants your opinion on downloadable content, because he hasn't seen any announcement for Underworld downloadable content. Is it coming, and also what's your opinion in general?
Yeah, it's coming. I probably shouldn't say any more than that. My opinion of it is, it's interesting because again, I'm feeling very old all of a sudden. But back in the late *90s at Origin, or the mid *90s, we were doing expansion packs for Wing Commander and the Ultima games, small adventures that would extend the experience of playing those games. And what we found was they just didn't sell well enough to support the development costs. But that's completely changed now. And now it's like, as much as I actually said this on Facebook the other day, which again, one story never worked. I'm a guy who wishes games would just end. I want an experience and say, yep, that was great. Now I'm moving on to the next game. I mean, that's kind of where my heart is at. But that's not the world we live in now. I mean, everybody's going after, long tail live support. And I think it's an interesting thing to do. I think you have to do it now. And so I'm going to learn to embrace it.
Seems like it's inevitable, yeah. And one more from Michelle on our team, kind of basic for people starting out in game development. What else does it take besides knowing, quote unquote, how to create the game to get it made? Like, what's the next step from having the idea?
Well,
what advice would you give?
Okay, so there are a couple of potential questions in there. If you want to know how to go from an idea to a game, there's no easy answer. I mean, there are people who can make a game all by themselves, and there are people like me who need a team around them. It's hard to make any blanket statements. But the one thing I would say is it takes perseverance. Making games is grindingly hard. It will crush you if you don't absolutely love it. And so the difference between an amateur or a student and a professional is that the professional finishes.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's always going to be great, but you finish. And that's the most important thing. I mean, frankly, if you're looking for a job in gaming, showing that you can finish something, not that you can do a student project that looks okay and it's kind of halfway there. No, if you can finish something, that will really help you get a job for sure, if that's what you're looking for. The other implied question that I don't think was asked, but I'm going to answer it anyway, is how do you break in? How do you get into gaming in the first place? And whether you're one person alone in your bedroom or you're part of a 200-person team, there are two things you have to do. Either become the most amazing generalist and become an indie developer, or specialize. You have to be the best at something because the competition is crazy. And the advice I would give, people think I'm nuts when I say this, but yes, this is a highly technical field. Yes, we are making software, but don't neglect the humanities. From a design standpoint, understanding architecture and economics and behavioral psychology and history and being able to communicate clearly, those are all critical things because you never know what you're going to need to know on any given game. So get as well-rounded an education as you can, even if you're teaching yourself. Get a well-rounded education. And then don't be just a person who says they play games. I hate it in interviews. The quickest way to not get a job with me is to say, I play games all the time. That's what I do. I love games. Everybody loves games. But if all you do is play games and you don't read and you don't play sports and you don't go to movies and you don't listen to music and, whatever else, you don't cook.
Right.
All you're going to bring to the table is old ideas. So have a life,
That's great advice. That's really cool. And I think, Russ, you had another thought or comment?
I just wanted to say thank you to the Sinespace team and Warren for doing this, and thank you for letting us be a part of it at the Escapist. I think it's, we just relaunched this year with our Volume 2, and we're, our goal is to create this type of channel between the readers and game developers. I think in general, one of the trends we're seeing in games is that we're forgetting how to talk to people who make games in a way that's constructive and positive. And I think that, helping correct the course on that is one of our goals. And this evening has been a really good example of how that can be possible and how that can be useful. So thank you all. And Warren, thank you so much. It's always great to talk to you.
Hey, my pleasure. And by the way, the Escapist was great, and I'm sure the new iteration of it is going to be great too.
Thank you so much. We're trying real hard.
Yeah, and Warren, thank you so much for coming and talking. This has been really fascinating. Everyone give Warren a round of applause. Thank you so much. And can't wait to play Underworld Descendant.
Fantastic.
Very cool.
Thanks.